Hey guys, welcome to Just Sleep Stories. Tonight we're doing something that is going to feel uncomfortably familiar, like finding an old vision board from 2 decades ago and realizing none of it came true. We're going back to the 1950s, a decade of chrome bumpers, nuclear paranoia, TV dinners that tasted like disappointment, and one very bold question that every scientist, journalist, futurist and bored housewife with a magazine subscription was asking. What will the year 2000 look like? And let me be clear about something. These people were not just casually curious. They were aggressively optimistic in a way that should concern us all. They believed, with the sincere, wholehearted confidence of someone who has never once been wrong about anything, that by the year 2000, you would be commuting to work in a personal flying car, eating dinner in the form of a single pill, and living in a house that cleaned itself while a robot folded your laundry, and your children were educated by a talking television set. They thought the future would be chrome, clean, and completely sorted out by Tuesday. They were, to put it gently, not entirely correct. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really does mean the world to me, and I will never ask you to do it aggressively. A gentle tap, a casual click, that's all. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always somehow 3 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply reassuring. If someone suggested this topic, thank you. Your instincts are impeccable and your sleep schedule concerns me in the best possible way. Because here is what I want you to think about before we begin. Have you ever wondered what 1950s America actually believed the future would feel like? Did they think you'd be thin from eating food pills and rested from letting your robot do your chores? Did they imagine that by the year 2000, nobody would have a bad back, a passive-aggressive co-worker, or a drawer full of mystery cables? Did they think traffic would be solved? Taxes? The particular psychological pain of being put on hold for 45 minutes by your insurance company? Did they believe people in the year 2000 would be calm, efficient, well-rested, and fully in control of their lives? Or did some small, quiet part of them suspect that we would still be tired, still be confused, and still be eating cereal for dinner at 11 p.m. while staring at a glowing rectangle? Did they picture you? Specifically you, lying in bed, listening to a voice describe their predictions, inside a device thinner than a paperback novel, connected to the entire accumulated knowledge of human civilization, using it to fall asleep? I don't think they did. Congratulations, you have just woken up in 1954. There is a television the size of a small refrigerator in your living room, your coffee percolator is on the counter, and somewhere in a laboratory, a man in a white coat is drawing diagrams of your future. He is very confident. He is also very wrong. Welcome to the world that was going to be yours. Let's talk about the car. Not your car, sitting in a parking lot with a busted AC and a mysterious rattle. The future car. The one they promised you. In the 1950s, the flying personal automobile was not considered science fiction. It was considered a Tuesday that hadn't arrived yet. Futurists, engineers, Popular Mechanics magazine, and at least a dozen optimistic corporations all agreed. By the year 2000, you would not be sitting in traffic. You would be above traffic, gliding through the sky in your sleek, bubble-topped personal aircraft, waving down at the poor fools still using roads. The road itself was expected to be obsolete, a charming relic, like a horse trough or a butter churn. Instead, you would simply punch your destination into a console, lean back in your contoured seat, and let the autopilot whisk you through clean, organised airspace in about 15 minutes. Nobody stopped to ask what would happen when 300 million people all tried to do this at the same time during a Friday afternoon in November. The sky, it turns out, has the same problem as the highway, just with more altitude and significantly worse consequences for a fender bender. And this wasn't just idle dreaming. Real companies built real prototypes. The Aerocar, designed by Moulton Taylor in 1949, was a genuine road-legal aircraft that could fold its wings and drive to the grocery store. Henry Ford himself had declared as early as 1940 that a combination airplane and motorcar was coming. Popular Mechanics ran cover stories showing families loading their bubble-topped flyers for weekend trips the way you load a station wagon, casually, routinely, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a flight path in the other. You can almost picture it. You wake up on a Saturday morning in the year 2000. You walk out to your garage, which in these illustrations is always spotless, always slightly larger than necessary, always bathed in the golden light of an optimistic morning. You press a button. The wings unfold. You taxi down your driveway, past your neighbour Harold, who is doing the same thing, and you lift off from the end of your cul-de-sac with the understated ease of someone backing out of a parking space. There are no air traffic controllers in this vision. There is no licensing bureaucracy. There is no question of what happens when Harold misjudges his altitude and clips your antenna because Harold had 2 glasses of wine with dinner and nobody has figured out aerial sobriety checkpoints yet. These are problems for a later Tuesday. The Tuesday of the 1950s is still busy imagining the chrome. The Ford Motor Company's experimental Volante triathodine concept from 1958 featured 3 ducted fans and was shown in promotional films gliding through city airspace with the calm confidence of a car that has never once thought about what happens to the people below when something goes mechanically wrong at altitude. It looked incredible. It never flew more than a few feet off the ground. But the illustration of it, the illustration of it, was everything the era promised. What actually happened by the year 2000, of course, is that the average American was sitting in traffic on the same asphalt roads that existed in 1954, listening to the radio, inching forward, wondering if the exit they need is the next one or the one after. The flying car had not arrived. The autopilot had not arrived. The clean, organised airspace had absolutely not arrived. What had arrived was a GPS unit telling you to turn left in 300 feet in a slightly condescending voice. The future of transportation came. It just came with a toll lane and a construction delay and an estimated arrival time that keeps getting pushed back. You know, like traffic. It's time for dinner. And by 1950s standards, dinner in the year 2000 was going to be elegant, efficient, and the size of a small breath mint. The food pill, that shining beacon of nutritional optimism, was one of the most enthusiastically predicted features of the future, and it tells you almost everything you need to know about what 1950s America was secretly tired of. The idea was simple. Scientists would compress an entire balanced meal, proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, and presumably the psychological comfort of a home-cooked Sunday roast, into a single capsule that you would swallow with a glass of water and be done with it. No cooking, no dishes, no spending 45 minutes at the grocery store trying to remember if you already have paprika. Just pop the pill, declare it dinner, and move on with your enormously productive future life. The food pill appeared in serious scientific publications, in World's Fair exhibits, and in the breathless, future-gazing columns of newspapers that had apparently decided the most pressing question of the coming century was whether anyone would ever have to dice an onion again. The scientific logic, in its way, was not entirely unreasonable. Nutritional science was advancing rapidly in the post-war era. Vitamins had been isolated. Caloric requirements were being calculated with increasing precision. It genuinely seemed possible to someone in 1954, brimming with post-war optimism and perhaps a little too much confidence in the linear march of progress, that the full nutritional complexity of a human meal might eventually be compressed into something you could carry in your shirt pocket. What the food pill enthusiasts failed to account for was the human relationship with eating, which turns out to be approximately 90% about something other than nutrition. It is about the smell of bread. It is about the sound a steak makes. It is about sitting across a table from someone you like and sharing something warm. It is about your grandmother's specific recipe for a dish that tastes like a childhood afternoon. A combination of ingredients and technique and memory that no capsule has ever successfully replicated, and that no capsule ever will. By the year 2000, the food pill had not arrived. What had arrived instead was a world more obsessed with food than any previous generation in human history. There were television channels dedicated entirely to cooking. There were restaurants in every conceivable style from every conceivable culture. There were farmers' markets and artisanal cheese shops and enthusiastic arguments about the correct way to make a particular regional pasta. People were spending more time thinking about food, talking about food, photographing food, and watching other people cook food than at any previous point in recorded history. The meal kit subscription service arrived, which delivered pre-measured ingredients to your door so you could cook the dinner yourself rather than simply eating it, which is almost the exact opposite of a food pill, and yet was greeted as a marvellous innovation. The protein shake arrived, which is arguably the closest thing to a food pill that actually exists, and it is consumed primarily by people who describe it as functional rather than pleasurable, which is perhaps the most honest review any food has ever received. The 1950s imagined that by the year 2000 we would have evolved beyond the need to cook. What actually happened is that we evolved a deeply complicated emotional relationship with cooking, built entire media empires around it, and still occasionally stood in front of the open refrigerator at 7 in the evening, staring into it as though it might eventually volunteer a suggestion. Some problems are not solved by progress. Some problems are just renegotiated. Let's talk about the robot, specifically the domestic robot, the tireless, cheerful, chrome-plated household servant that 1950s America was absolutely certain you would have by the year 2000. Not a Roomba, not a dishwasher, a robot, upright, humanoid, probably named something like Servo or Max, that would glide through your home on silent wheels, folding laundry, mopping floors, preparing meals, and generally handling every tedious domestic task that stood between you and your full, glorious, leisure-filled future self. The magazines painted this picture with tremendous enthusiasm. Housewives of the 1950s, already exhausted by the genuine labour of running a household without the conveniences we take for granted, were told to hold on. Help was coming, and it was going to be metal and tireless, and would never complain or need a day off. The domestic robot appeared on magazine covers, in World's Fair demonstrations, in RCA promotional films, and in the optimistic illustrations of home technology publications that promised the household of the future would essentially run itself, while its human occupants pursued higher things. Westinghouse built a robot named Electro in 1939 who could walk, talk, and smoke a cigarette, which was considered impressive enough to tour the country. His successor, a robot dog named Sparko, could sit and beg. These demonstrations were treated as the opening chapters of a story whose conclusion, the fully automated household, seemed only a matter of time and engineering. By the year 2000, the thinking went, Electro's great-grandchildren would be doing your ironing. The vision was specific and it was detailed. The domestic robot of the year 2000 would recognize your voice. It would know your schedule. It would have your dinner ready when you arrived home, your floors cleaned while you were out, your laundry folded and sorted and returned to its correct drawer with the methodical precision of a machine that has never once put a black sock in the wrong pile. It would not get tired. It would not need health insurance. It would not call in sick the morning of your dinner party. What actually arrived by the year 2000 was considerably more modest. The Roomba arrived in 2002, a flat disc that moved around your floor in a pattern that seemed random but was theoretically intentional, occasionally getting stuck under the couch, sometimes falling downstairs, requiring you to remember to empty it and charge it and rescue it from the bathroom where it had been spinning in confused circles for 40 minutes. It was useful. It was not Max. Voice-activated home assistants arrived a little later, cylindrical devices that sat on your kitchen counter and could answer questions and set timers and play music, but could not fold a shirt or mop a floor or do any of the physical labour that the domestic robot of the 1950s had promised to eliminate. You could ask them to add milk to your shopping list, which they would do correctly, and then you still had to go to the shop and get the milk yourself and come home and put it in the refrigerator, exactly as humans had always done. The truly capable humanoid domestic robot, the one that can navigate a real home, handle the infinite variety of domestic physical tasks, and do your laundry without destroying anything, remains, as of the early 21st century, a work in progress. It is coming, apparently. It has been coming for about 70 years now, and it is still on its way, arriving just slightly later than the flying car, keeping company with the food pill somewhere just over the horizon of the next remarkable Tuesday. Here is something the 1950s believed with a startling amount of sincerity. Atomic energy was going to fix basically everything. Not just power plants, everything. Cars, trains, airplanes, houses. The 1950s vision of atomic energy was less carefully monitored industrial process, and more magic sunshine that makes all problems go away. There were genuine, serious proposals from genuine, serious engineers for nuclear-powered passenger aircraft, nuclear-powered cargo ships, nuclear-powered automobiles, which, to be clear, would have placed a small fission reactor somewhere in the vicinity of the back seat, and nuclear-powered homes, where a single pellet of enriched uranium would heat your house and run your appliances for years without interruption. This was not fringe thinking. This appeared in mainstream publications, was discussed at conferences, and was illustrated in full colour in magazines that sat on coffee tables in ordinary American living rooms. The word atomic in the 1950s carried the same energy that certain technology words carry today, attached to everything, promised to solve everything, and regarded with an optimism that perhaps outpaced the safety documentation by several decades. The Ford Motor Company unveiled the Nucleon concept car in 1958, a full design proposal for a passenger vehicle powered by a small nuclear reactor in the rear, which would need to be exchanged at special roadside atomic service stations the way you now exchange a propane tank. The company produced a scale model. They published promotional materials. Nobody appears to have asked the question of what would happen to the atomic service station attendants' long-term health outcomes, and if they did, the answer was apparently filed somewhere it would not inconvenience the brochure. The nuclear-powered house was similarly specific in its optimism. Ford's own research division estimated that a single nuclear fuel capsule could power an entire household for the lifetime of its occupants. There would be no electricity bills, no gas bills, no dependence on the external energy grid. Just a small humming unit in your utility room, warm and reliable, powering your push-button kitchen and your robot housekeeper and your personal aircraft charger indefinitely and without complaint. The appeal, from the 1950s perspective, was entirely understandable. They had just watched atomic energy level 2 cities in a matter of seconds. If that much power could be released destructively, surely the same principle could be harnessed productively, and the scale of the thing was intoxicating. Uranium was extraordinarily energy-dense. A small amount could theoretically do what enormous quantities of coal and oil were currently doing. The economics seemed revolutionary. The physics seemed cooperative. The safety seemed like a detail. What nobody in the Nucleon marketing department dwelt on at length was the radiation. Not the explosive kind, the quiet, patient, chronic kind that accumulates in tissue and does its work slowly and invisibly over years and decades. Shielding a nuclear reactor adequately enough for it to sit behind your back seat while you drove to the shops would require so much material that the resulting vehicle would need to weigh something in the range of 50 tons, which creates its own engineering complications that the promotional scale model did not fully convey. The nuclear airplane did get seriously tested. The aircraft nuclear propulsion program ran from 1946 to 1961 and spent the equivalent of billions of dollars without producing a functional aircraft, primarily because the reactor shielding required to keep the crew alive also made the plane unable to fly, which was considered a design limitation. By the time the program was cancelled, the atomic future was already beginning to acquire the specific quality of a promise that has been extended too many times without delivery. The nuclear-powered house never left the brochure. The nucleon never left the scale model. Your utility room contains a water heater. It does not glow. Let's move into the kitchen, because in the 1950s the kitchen of the future was a room of almost spiritual convenience. The push-button kitchen, and that was genuinely what they called it, with no irony whatsoever, was the central promise of domestic futurism. By the year 2000, preparing a meal would require nothing more strenuous than pressing a series of illuminated buttons on a sleek wall-mounted panel, after which perfectly portioned, nutritionally calibrated food would emerge from automated compartments, already cooked, already plated, already the correct temperature. The oven would know what you were making, the refrigerator would know what you were out of. Every surface would be some form of miraculous, stain-resistant, self-sanitizing, space-age material that required neither scrubbing nor the particular spiritual resignation that comes from scrubbing a casserole dish at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night. What they did not predict was that by the year 2000, the kitchen would be more complicated than ever. 17 different appliances on the counter, a drawer full of take-out menus, and the haunting memory of a bread maker used twice and then quietly moved to the garage. The 1950s had good reason to believe the kitchen was due for a revolution. The post-war era had already transformed the American kitchen dramatically. Electric refrigerators had replaced iceboxes. Electric ranges had replaced wood stoves. Automatic washing machines were arriving in homes that had previously required hours of physical labour for laundry. The trajectory was clear, and it was accelerating, and if each decade brought this much change, the kitchen of the year 2000 would surely be unrecognisable from its current form. Companies threw themselves into the vision with genuine commercial enthusiasm. General Electric produced concept demonstrations of automated kitchens for promotional films. Frigidaire unveiled kitchen of the future installations at World's Fairs, where visitors could watch automated panels prepare demonstration meals with minimal human involvement. The American housewife of the 1950s was told, with great confidence, that her counterpart in the year 2000 would spend perhaps 15 minutes a day on food preparation, and those 15 minutes would consist primarily of pressing the correct buttons. The microwave oven arrived, which is arguably the most successful piece of push-button kitchen technology actually produced, and it is used primarily to reheat coffee and defrost things that probably should have been taken out of the freezer yesterday. It presses buttons. It heats things quickly. It is not glamorous. It does not emerge gleaming meals from hidden compartments. It mostly warms up leftovers and occasionally produces a bowl of soup that is mysteriously cold on the outside and the temperature of a small star in the centre. The dishwasher arrived, which was genuinely transformative for domestic labour, and which the 1950s correctly predicted would become a standard household fixture. The automatic coffee maker arrived. The food processor arrived. And then the kitchen became more complicated rather than less, because each new appliance required counter space and cleaning and maintenance, and the particular form of decision fatigue that comes from owning more tools than you know when to use. By the year 2000, the average kitchen contained more technology than the entire 1950s imagined it would need, and its occupants were still standing in it at 7 in the evening trying to decide what to make for dinner, still washing the pan by hand because the good pans aren't dishwasher safe, still discovering at the worst possible moment that they are out of one essential ingredient and the shops are about to close. Progress arrived. It just arrived with more attachments than anticipated, and an instruction manual nobody read. Here is a prediction that you will find simultaneously hilarious and deeply melancholy, depending on what time you're reading this, and how many unread messages are currently waiting for your attention. In the 1950s, multiple serious economists, technologists, and social scientists predicted that by the year 2000, rising productivity enabled by automation and computing would reduce the standard working week to somewhere between 15 and 20 hours. Some predicted even less. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith wrote about the coming challenge of leisure. John Maynard Keynes had already predicted in 1930 that his grandchildren might work 15 hours a week. The question serious thinkers were seriously asking was not whether automation would free up human time, it was what humans would possibly do with all of it. This was treated as a genuine social challenge. Sociologists fretted. Philosophers wrote papers. The question of how to fill a life liberated from drudgery was considered one of the great coming crises of the 20th century, and it was approached with the same earnest institutional energy that was being applied to the flying car and the food pill. If people only needed to work 15 hours a week by the year 2000, the thinking went. They were going to need somewhere to go with the remaining time, and society had better start planning. The optimism was not without foundation. Productivity in the post-war American economy was genuinely rising at extraordinary rates. The mechanization of agriculture had already dramatically reduced the labor required to feed the country. The mechanization of manufacturing was reducing the labor required to produce goods. Computing, in its early, room-filling, vacuum tube form, was beginning to reduce the labor required to process information. The trend lines, projected forward to the year 2000, produced numbers that seemed to make the 15-hour work week not just possible, but conservative. What the projections did not fully account for was the remarkable human capacity to fill available time with new forms of work, and the equally remarkable institutional capacity to expand the definition of what constitutes necessary labour. Productivity did increase, dramatically, continuously, and exactly as the economists predicted. What changed was not the number of hours worked, but the amount of output expected from those hours and the scope of communication and coordination that technology enabled, which expanded to fill every available hour and then began working on the hours that had previously been reserved for sleep. The email arrived, then the work email on the personal device, then the messaging application that kept the work email company at 11 in the evening, then the expectation, never formally stated but universally understood, that availability was continuous and response times were measured in minutes rather than days. The leisure crisis never materialized because the definition of work expanded quietly and comprehensively to absorb every hour that technology liberated from previous forms of labor. By the year 2000, the average American worker was working more hours than their 1950s counterpart, not fewer, and doing so with the ambient awareness that the work was never quite finished, and the device in their pocket could confirm this at any moment. The 15-hour work week remains an aspiration held by approximately the same number of people who are currently waiting for the flying car. The sociologists who worried about how people would fill their leisure time were not wrong to worry about leisure. They were wrong about its direction. The problem by the year 2000 was not too much free time. It was the growing difficulty of protecting what little remained, the 2 weeks of vacation that turned into 1.5 because of the thing at work, the weekend that started checking email on Saturday morning, the evening that was technically free but spent in the posture of someone waiting to be needed. The leisure problem arrived. It just arrived upside down. Somewhere in the 1950s imagination, beneath the pressures of the Cold War and the gleam of suburban optimism, there was a vision of the ocean floor as humanity's next frontier, and that frontier was going to have zip codes. The underwater city was a recurring dream of mid-century futurism, painted in gorgeous watercolour-washed illustrations in magazines and encyclopedias, dome-shaped structures resting on the seafloor, connected by transparent tunnels through which well-dressed citizens would walk to work, schools, shops, and restaurants, all bathed in the blue-green light filtering down from the surface above. The ocean, in this vision, was not cold, dark, pressurized, and full of creatures that would eat your submarine. It was a neighborhood, just a wetter one. Engineers wrote papers about it. The United States Navy funded experimental underwater habitats. Jacques Cousteau was enthusiastic. There was a genuine, broad-based belief that deep-sea living was not just possible but imminent, a matter of decades rather than centuries, and that the population pressures of the coming century would make the development of undersea real estate not merely desirable, but necessary. The science at its optimistic edges had some traction. Cousteau and his team demonstrated with the Conself experiments in the early 1960s that people could live and work on the ocean floor for extended periods. Conself 2 placed 6 divers at a depth of 10 metres in the Red Sea for a full month in 1963, and they survived, worked, and reported that the experience was manageable if not entirely comfortable. The United States Navy ran the Sealab program throughout the 1960s, placing experimental habitats on the seafloor with crews of aquanauts, who demonstrated that saturation diving could support extended deep-sea occupation. These were genuine achievements, and they were interpreted in the most optimistic possible light. If 6 people could live in a steel cylinder on the seafloor for a month, surely 2,000 people could live in a pressurized dome city by the year 2000. The scaling logic felt sound to those who had watched the American suburb grow from a handful of demonstration homes in the 1940s to tens of millions of houses by the 1960s. Growth at that rate, applied to underwater habitation, produced projections that were architecturally extraordinary and hydraulically terrifying. What the Dome City enthusiasts were perhaps underestimating was the ocean itself, which is not a passive medium waiting to be developed, but an active, pressurized, corrosive environment that disagrees with human infrastructure in dozens of simultaneous ways. The pressure at significant depths is sufficient to compress steel. The salt water that looks so invitingly blue in the magazine illustrations corrodes metal with patient efficiency. The temperature at depth is a consistent and committed cold that requires enormous energy to counteract. Supplying food, air, fresh water, and emergency evacuation to a city on the ocean floor presents logistical challenges that the illustrations with their serene transparent tunnels and well-lit corridors tended to omit. The Sealab program was cancelled in 1969 after Sealab 3 suffered a catastrophic failure during installation that killed an aquanaut named Barry Cannon, whose death was attributed to a faulty carbon dioxide scrubber, a piece of equipment whose failure in a midwater location offered essentially no rescue options. The ocean, as a residential environment, had provided its note of objection. By the year 2000, humanity had not moved underwater. We had, however, developed extraordinary technology for observing, studying, and appreciating the deep ocean from a safe and sensible distance. Remotely operated vehicles explored the seafloor in detail. Submersibles dove to the deepest trenches. Ocean research stations gathered data of enormous scientific value. We understood the deep ocean better in the year 2000 than at any previous point in history. We understood it well enough, in fact, to appreciate why living there was a considerably more complicated proposition than the Dome City illustrations had suggested, and to be quietly grateful that our cities are on land, where the infrastructure problems are merely expensive rather than existential. In the 1950s, weather was considered a problem that would shortly be solved, not just predicted, controlled. The weather machine, or more formally, the science of large-scale weather modification, was regarded by a significant number of scientists and futurists as a realistic near-term achievement. By the year 2000, the thinking went, humans would be able to dial in the weather the way you dial in a thermostat. Need rain for your crops on Wednesday? Scheduled. Want a clear, mild weekend for the outdoor event you have been planning for 6 months? Done. The ability to end droughts, prevent hurricanes before they formed, dissolve tornadoes, redirect storms. All of this was projected as a natural outcome of applied science and American ingenuity, meeting a problem with sufficient resources and determination. Some proposals were quite specific. A network of high-altitude stations that could seed cloud formations on demand, or massive coastal installations that would warm or cool ocean currents to influence regional climate patterns. The technology of cloud seeding, in which silver iodide particles are dispersed into clouds to encourage precipitation, had been demonstrated by General Electric researcher Vincent Schaefer in 1946, and the results were taken as proof of concept for everything that might follow. If you could make it rain, surely you could eventually make it do whatever you needed. The military applications were taken seriously enough to fund. Project Cirrus in the late 1940s attempted to seed hurricanes in the Atlantic to reduce their intensity. The results were ambiguous at best and potentially catastrophic at worst. One seeded hurricane changed course in a way that may or may not have been related to the intervention, and the subsequent lawsuit threats from affected coastal states persuaded the project's administrators to proceed with caution, which in this context meant continuing the research while managing the liability questions more carefully. Vietnam saw the weather weapon used in earnest. Operation Popeye, which ran from 1967 to 1972, seeded clouds over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in an attempt to extend the monsoon season and make supply routes impassable. The classified operation was eventually exposed by journalist Jack Anderson and led directly to the Environmental Modification Convention of 1977, in which nations agreed not to use weather modification as a weapon of war, an agreement whose existence confirms both that the technology had developed enough to be worth prohibiting, and that the 1950s optimism about weather control was not entirely without foundation. What the weather machine enthusiasts underestimated was the atmosphere's complexity. The climate system is not a simple mechanism with accessible controls, it is a chaotic system in the technical mathematical sense, meaning that small changes in initial conditions can produce wildly different outcomes at scale. Seeding a cloud in one location can affect precipitation patterns hundreds of miles away in ways that are genuinely difficult to predict. The butterfly effect as a concept was developed by meteorologist Edward Lorenz in the 1960s, specifically in the context of weather prediction, and its implications for weather control were even more humbling than its implications for forecasting. By the year 2000, weather forecasting had improved dramatically, and weather control remained limited to small-scale cloud seeding with modest and variable results. What nobody in 1954 had fully anticipated was that by the year 2000, the weather problem would have reversed itself, that instead of humans controlling the climate, human activity would be changing the climate in ways that were difficult to control, and whose full consequences were still being calculated. The weather machine arrived. It just ran in the wrong direction, and it turned out the hardest part was not making it rain, but figuring out how to make it stop doing whatever we had accidentally started. Let's talk about walking, or more specifically, the 1950s plan to eliminate it. The moving sidewalk, a continuous, gently flowing belt that would carry pedestrians through cities without requiring them to expend the physical effort of moving their own legs, was one of the more quietly audacious predictions of mid-century futurism, and it appeared everywhere. In illustrations of future cities, in World's Fair exhibitions, in architectural proposals for the gleaming metropolises of the year 2000. The logic was straightforward and also slightly baffling. Why should a person in the future have to walk when technology could simply move them? Cities of the future would have networks of these belts moving at varying speeds, a slow lane for boarding, faster lanes for longer distances, so that a citizen of the year 2000 could step onto the pavement and simply be carried, hands-free, hat still on, all the way to their destination. The fact that this would require essentially paving over every sidewalk in every city with precision engineering maintained to tolerances that would make any city engineer quietly emotional was considered a minor logistical detail to be resolved later. The moving sidewalk was not a new idea even in the 1950s. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago featured a working moving sidewalk that carried visitors along a lakefront pier, and the technology was revisited at subsequent fairs and exhibitions with recurring enthusiasm. H.G. Wells described moving roadways in his 1901 novel Anticipation. The concept was old enough to feel established, familiar enough to feel inevitable, and had been under discussion long enough that its arrival by the year 2000 seemed merely a question of political will and urban planning budget. The World's Fair of 1964 in New York, the one that GM and Ford and countless other corporations used as a canvas for their visions of the year 2000, featured moving walkway demonstrations that carried visitors between pavilions with the smooth, slightly disconcerting sensation of motion without effort. Visitors rode them with the delighted expressions of people experiencing something that feels, for just a moment, genuinely futuristic, and then stepped off at their destination and walked the rest of the way because the moving sidewalk only went to a specific place and you needed to go somewhere slightly different. That gap between the demonstration and the citywide network was never closed. Moving walkways exist in airports, long carpeted belts that carry tired travellers between distant gates, and in a handful of transit systems where they connect platforms to exits across distances that are long enough to justify the infrastructure. They work. They're useful. They are also perpetually under maintenance, occasionally reversing direction without warning, and producing the specific frustration of someone who steps onto a moving walkway, moving at a walking pace, and immediately encounters a large group of people standing still on it, which removes the entire efficiency benefit of the technology. The city of the year 2000 did not have moving sidewalks on its streets. It had sidewalks, which are the same technology of pressed flat stone and cement that cities have been using for centuries, and its citizens walked on them with the same 2 feet that citizens of every previous century had used, at roughly the same pace, with the same occasional mild complaint about the distance. What the year 2000 city added to the walking experience was the smartphone, which meant that a significant percentage of its walkers were no longer looking where they were going, which created new and interesting pedestrian hazards that the moving sidewalk, for all its imagined sophistication, would not have solved and might have made considerably more entertaining. By 1954, humanity had not yet left Earth's atmosphere. By 1969, we had walked on the moon, and so, in those early heady decades of the space age, the projection of what the year 2000 would look like in orbit was, understandably perhaps, extremely ambitious. Permanent moon bases, rotating space stations housing hundreds of people, Mars colonies in the planning stages or already inhabited, asteroid mining operations, regular commercial passenger flights to orbital platforms where ordinary tourists, not just highly trained astronauts, would float in zero gravity and look down at the blue marble of Earth through panoramic windows. This was not considered fantasy. This was considered schedule. The trajectory of the space program from the late 1950s through the late 1960s suggested a pace of progress so extraordinary that permanent off-world human habitation by the year 2000 seemed almost conservative. The United States went from putting a satellite in orbit in 1958 to landing men on the moon in 1969, 11 years of progress so rapid and so public that extrapolating it forward another 30 years produced results that felt not just possible but modest. If we went from nothing to the moon in 11 years, what would 30 more years produce? Werner von Braun, the architect of the Saturn V rocket that took Apollo to the moon, laid out a detailed plan in the 1950s for the permanent human occupation of space that read like a project timeline rather than a wish list. A space station in Earth orbit by the early 1960s, to be used as a staging point for lunar missions, a permanent lunar base by the 1970s, a manned Mars mission by the 1980s. The plan was illustrated in Collier's Weekly in a series of articles accompanied by paintings by Chesley Bonestell, whose technical beauty and plausible scale made the whole sequence feel not like imagination but like documentation of something that had already been decided. What nobody fully anticipated was that the political will that had produced the Apollo program was specific to its moment, a product of Cold War competition and the particular galvanizing effect of Sputnik, and the particular presidential ambition of John Kennedy, and that this will would not automatically sustain itself beyond the achievement of the original goal. Apollo 11 landed on the moon in July of 1969. Apollo 17, the last moon landing, departed in December of 1972. 41 months separated the first human footprint on the moon from the last one, and in the half-century since, no human being has returned. The reasons are budget and political priority, and the sobering reality that sustained human presence in deep space is not merely expensive, but brutally difficult in ways that the 1950s optimism had not fully confronted. The moon is not merely far away, it is an environment of extraordinary hostility, with no atmosphere, temperature swings of 500 degrees between sun and shadow, and a radiation environment that requires significant shielding to survive over extended periods. The engineering solutions exist in principle. The commitment to implement them at scale has proven more complicated to sustain. By the year 2000, humanity had the International Space Station, a remarkable and genuinely historic achievement. A habitable structure in orbit continuously occupied since November of that year. A permanent human presence in space that the 1950s would have recognized as the beginning of the dream, even if not its fulfillment. The Mars colony had not arrived. The moon base had not arrived. The tourist flights to orbital hotels had not quite arrived, though they were approaching. The schedule, it turned out, had been optimistic. The dream, it turned out, was not wrong. It was simply running on a timeline that the 1950s, in the first exhilarating rush of the space age, had not fully accounted for, which is to say, running late, but still running, which is more than can be said for the flying car. Segment 11, the personal helicopter. Parking has never been more complicated. Let's talk about the personal helicopter, because while the flying car was the headline act of 1950s transportation futurism, its close cousin, the personal rotorcraft, the gyrocopter, the one-family vertical takeoff machine that was going to sit in your garage next to the station wagon, was running a very enthusiastic supporting role. The idea was essentially this. Just as the automobile had democratized travel on the ground in the early 20th century, the personal helicopter would democratize travel through the air by the latter half. Every family, it was projected, would eventually own one. You would fly yourself to work, to the shops, to visit relatives 3 states away, hopping into the air the way you hopped into a car, without a runway, without a flight plan, just a key, a throttle, and the open sky. Manufacturers produced prototype personal helicopters in the 1950s and 60s with genuine optimism. Popular Mechanics ran articles about which model you might prefer. Nobody in these articles asked what would happen to the collective airspace when the entire population of Greater Los Angeles tried to fly to work at 8 in the morning. Nobody asked about weather. Nobody asked about the training required to operate a rotorcraft safely, which in the real world requires considerably more skill than operating an automobile, and in which the consequences of a beginner's error are not a scraped bumper, but an uncontrolled descent from several hundred feet. These were considered details. The illustration came first. The Bell Aircraft Corporation was among the most serious players. Bell had built the first American helicopter to enter mass production, the Bell Model 47, whose bubble canopy and exposed tail boom became the definitive visual image of the personal helicopter, the one you recognise from every 1950s magazine illustration, hovering over a suburban rooftop with a smiling family inside. Bell genuinely believed the personal helicopter market would materialise on a large scale. They designed their aircraft with civilian buyers in mind, worked on reducing complexity, and produced promotional materials depicting the Model 47 as household furniture, something you saved up for, bought and kept in the garage alongside your lawnmower. The Helicopter Association of America, founded in the 1950s, confidently predicted that personal helicopters would be as common as automobiles within a generation. The Federal Aviation Administration began making early regulatory preparations for the expected surge in personal aerial traffic. City planners in forward-thinking municipalities discussed helipads the way they discussed parking structures, as necessary infrastructure for a mode of transportation that was clearly coming. The question was not whether the personal helicopter would arrive. The question was how to prepare for it adequately. What none of the projections adequately confronted was the mechanical complexity of the helicopter itself, which is perhaps the most mechanically demanding flying machine ever developed for civilian use. A helicopter achieves flight through a continuous set of precisely coordinated adjustments. The main rotor, the tail rotor, the collective pitch, the cyclic control, all of which must work together correctly at all times for the aircraft to remain airborne. When they stop working correctly, the helicopter does not glide, it falls. The auto-rotation landing procedure that allows a helicopter with engine failure to land safely is a skill requiring hundreds of hours of practice to perform reliably, and even then, it requires altitude and open ground that suburban environments do not reliably provide. Insurance actuaries, looking at the personal helicopter dream from their particular professional angle, produced numbers that were not encouraging. The accident rate for small rotorcraft in the 1950s and 60s was substantially higher than for fixed-wing aircraft, which was itself substantially higher than for automobiles, which was already high enough that the insurance industry approached the personal helicopter market with the cautious enthusiasm of someone being asked to cover a lifestyle choice they have serious reservations about. By the year 2000, the personal helicopter had not arrived as a consumer product. What had arrived was the drone, a small, cheap GPS-stabilized rotorcraft that anyone could fly without a license, that crashed harmlessly when it malfunctioned, and that could be purchased for the price of a modest appliance. The personal helicopter dream, scaled down by about 95% and made electrically reliable, had found its consumer form. It just could not carry a person. It could, however, carry a camera, and in doing so it gave millions of people their first experience of seeing the world from above, which is, if you think about it, the part of the personal helicopter dream that was always really about something else. Let's talk about the computer, because the 1950s computer and the year 2000 computer have almost nothing in common except the word computer, and the gap between them is one of the most genuinely astonishing stories in the history of technology. In the 1950s, a computer was a room, literally a room, a refrigerator-cold, humming, blinking room full of vacuum tubes the size of your fist, magnetic tape reels the size of wagon wheels, and a crew of dedicated technicians whose full-time job was keeping the machine running long enough to solve a calculation that a modern smartphone could handle in a fraction of a second. These machines cost millions of dollars, belonged to governments and universities and large corporations, and were operated by specialists with advanced degrees. The predictions about computers in the year 2000 were therefore shaped by this context, which is why so many of them imagined that by the year 2000 there would be perhaps a dozen very large, very powerful computers serving the entire national population, giant electronic brains that citizens would interact with remotely, sending in questions and receiving answers through terminals in libraries or post offices. Nobody predicted 1 billion personal computers. Nobody predicted a device thinner than a magazine that fits in a shirt pocket and has more processing power than every computer in existence in 1954 combined. They extrapolated the computer they knew and made it bigger and more powerful. They did not imagine it becoming smaller, cheaper, and personal. That specific failure of imagination is perhaps the most instructive thing about the entire history of prediction. ENIAC, which many consider the first general-purpose electronic digital computer, was completed in 1945. It weighed 30 tons, occupied 1,800 square feet, consumed 150 kilowatts of power, and could perform about 5,000 additions per second. By the standards of the time, this was extraordinary. Newspaper headlines called it a giant brain. Scientists described its potential in terms that bordered on mystical. A machine that could calculate artillery firing tables in hours instead of days seemed, to those who had spent the war doing those calculations by hand, like something that had crossed a fundamental threshold in the history of intelligence. The question that emerged almost immediately was what else such a machine might eventually be capable of. Alan Turing had already proposed his famous test for machine intelligence in 1950, suggesting that a sufficiently capable computer would eventually be indistinguishable from a human in conversation. IBM's early commercial computers were marketed with a confidence about their eventual cognitive capabilities that went well beyond what the machines could actually do. The implication being that you were purchasing not just a calculating machine, but the early model of something that would eventually think. What the 1950s imagined was a computer that would centralize intelligence, a vast, authoritative electronic brain that the citizen would approach with questions and from which answers would descend. What arrived instead was a computer that distributed intelligence, a device that put the question-asking and the answer-finding capability into the hands of each individual user, connected to a network through which the accumulated knowledge of human civilization could be accessed from anywhere at any time. The centralized electronic brain never materialized. The distributed one materialized so completely that its absence from any moment of daily life now feels like an emergency. The transistor replaced the vacuum tube. The integrated circuit replaced the transistor. Moore's law described the doubling of transistor density every 2 years, with a regularity that produced over 5 decades improvements in computing power so extreme that the numbers require scientific notation to express accurately. The computer that filled a room became a computer that fit on a desk, then a laptop, then a device that fits in a pocket and communicates wirelessly with other devices around the globe at speeds measured in fractions of a second. By the year 2000, the electronic brain had not arrived as the 1950s imagined it, centralized, authoritative, approached through terminals in public buildings. It had arrived as something far stranger and more intimate, a device on every desk in every office and in most homes, connected to a global network of other devices, collectively forming something that no single machine in a government facility could have replicated and that no 1950s futurist had quite imagined. The electronic brain turned out to be everywhere at once. Nobody predicted that part. Nobody predicted that you would carry it in your pocket and use it to win arguments at dinner parties about facts that could be verified in 4 seconds. Some futures are stranger than the predictions in ways that only become obvious after the future has already arrived. One of the most confidently made and spectacularly incorrect predictions of the mid to late 20th century was the paperless office. Once computers became widely available in businesses during the 1970s and 80s, futurists who had been waiting patiently since the 1950s declared that the end of paper was now truly imminent. By the year 2000, the office would be a crisp, clean, entirely digital environment in which every document, every memo, every contract existed only on screens, filed, sorted, retrieved, and disposed of with a keystroke. No filing cabinets necessary, no paper trails, no forests sacrificed for quarterly reports that 3 people would read and nobody would remember. The logic was impeccable, which is perhaps why reality found it so easy to ignore. What actually happened is that the arrival of cheap, fast, widely available printers and photocopiers caused office paper consumption to increase dramatically through the 1980s and 90s, peaking right around the year 2000 in a towering monument to the gap between prediction and human behaviour. People liked to print things. They printed emails. They printed websites. They printed documents they already had digital copies of, just to have something they could hold, which suggested that the paperless office's designers had perhaps not fully understood what paper was actually for. The phrase paperless office was coined by Business Week magazine in a 1975 article that described a future in which paper would be replaced by electronic information systems with a confidence that seems, in retrospect, to have been based primarily on the author's personal preference rather than any systematic study of office behaviour. The article described the transition as inevitable and imminent, estimated it would be substantially complete by the mid-1980s, and was wrong in the specific and comprehensive way that predictions tend to be wrong, when they assume that because a technology makes a behaviour unnecessary, humans will stop engaging in it. Paper in offices had never been purely about information storage. It was about annotation, the ability to write in the margins, circle something, draw an arrow connecting 2 things on the same page with a physical pen that required no battery and produced no error message. It was about portability, in the specific sense of being able to carry a document into a meeting without requiring a power outlet. It was about authority. A signed paper document carried a weight of finality that a digital file, easily edited and redated, found difficult to replicate in the 1990s, before electronic signature technology matured. And it was about comfort, the deep mammalian satisfaction of holding information in your hands, which turned out to be harder to engineer out of human beings than the paperless office advocates had estimated. The electronic document management systems that were supposed to replace filing cabinets arrived, and they were genuinely useful, and they were implemented in offices alongside the filing cabinets rather than instead of them, because the migration of existing paper archives to digital formats turned out to be a project of such enormous scope and cost that most organizations implemented the new systems for new documents, while the old documents remained in their original cabinets, which were therefore not eliminated but merely joined by a new generation of technology that created its own storage requirements. By the year 2000, the average office contained more paper than it had in 1975, more filing cabinets than it had in 1975, more storage rooms full of document boxes than it had in 1975, and also a computer on every desk and a network printer humming in the corner, producing a continuous stream of documents that would be read, annotated with a ballpoint pen, filed in a physical folder, and retrieved 3 months later by someone who could not find the digital version. The paperless office arrived in the same way that the flying car arrived, as a concept, as an aspiration, as a direction of travel, and stalled there, somewhere between the elegant prediction and the deeply inconvenient reality of how offices actually worked when the people inside them were allowed to choose. In the 1950s, one of the most eagerly anticipated communication technologies of the future was the videophone, a telephone that also transmitted video, so that you could see the person you were speaking to as clearly as if they were in the room. It was demonstrated at world's fairs, illustrated in advertising campaigns, and predicted to become a standard household fixture by the 1980s or 90s at the latest. The appeal was obvious. Why merely hear a voice when you could see a face? Why strain to interpret tone in a disembodied voice when you could watch someone's expression? The future was going to be rich with visual human connection, a world where distance collapsed and faces replaced voices in every conversation. A TNT debuted the picture phone at the 1964 New York World's Fair to enormous public excitement. Visitors queued to make video calls between demonstration booths set up at the fair and a remote location, seeing a live image of a stranger's face on a small screen while speaking to them through a handset, and the experience was consistently described as astonishing, futuristic, and obviously the next great transformation in human communication. AT&T invested heavily in commercial picture phone infrastructure throughout the late 1960s and launched a commercial service in select cities in 1970. By 1973, fewer than 1,000 picture phone units had been installed nationwide. AT&T discontinued the service quietly and absorbed the loss. The failure of the picture phone in 1970 is one of the more instructive case studies in the gap between technology that works and technology that people want. The picture phone worked. The image quality was adequate. The connection was reliable enough. The problem was that it required both parties to have a unit, to be at their unit when the call came in, and to be in an appropriate state of appearance and environment for video visibility, which, it emerged, was a significantly higher bar than simply being near a telephone. People answering a phone call at home in 1970 were potentially in their pajamas, in the middle of dinner, in a room of considerable domestic chaos. The telephone did not require them to be presentable. The picture phone did. This was, for many people, not an upgrade. The technology persisted in corporate environments where video conferencing between executive suites could be managed as a formal, scheduled event requiring appropriate preparation. These systems cost tens of thousands of dollars per installation, required dedicated communication lines, and were used primarily for high-level meetings where the visual component genuinely added value to the communication. The personal household video phone remained perpetually imminent, always one generation of technology and one price reduction away from mass adoption throughout the 1970s, 80s and 90s. By the year 2000, the technology was essentially free. Internet video calling was available to anyone with a broadband connection and a webcam, and both of those requirements were being met by an increasing proportion of the population. Apple's iSight camera launched in 2003. Skype launched in 2003. The technical barriers that had kept the video phone from mass adoption had all been resolved, and the cost barriers had collapsed entirely. Video calling was now available to everyone, and everyone used it, and also spent a remarkable amount of energy avoiding it, disabling their cameras in meetings, positioning their laptops to show only a carefully neutral background, and developing a rich vocabulary of technical excuses for why the camera was unavailable today. The videophone arrived and discovered that the 1950s had correctly identified the technology people would want, and incorrectly assumed they would want to be seen while using it. Some futures arrive exactly as predicted, and are greeted with a privacy setting and a turned-off camera. The future of communication came. It just came with a mute button, which honestly might be the most human thing about it. The 1950s suburb was already a vision of the future made physical, neat rows of identical houses, fresh from the builder, filled with young families and new appliances and the quiet, expansive optimism of post-war prosperity. But the suburb of the year 2000, as imagined by the architects and urban planners and magazine illustrators of the era, was going to make the 1950s suburb look like a rough draft. Houses would be modular, easily reconfigured to suit growing families or changing needs. They would be entirely climate-controlled, insulated against every extreme of temperature, and equipped with automated systems for lighting, cleaning, and security that would respond to the occupants' habits and preferences without being asked. Every home would have a garage capable of housing the family's personal aircraft alongside the automobile. The vision was not merely technological, it was social. The suburb of the year 2000 would be designed with community in mind, shared green spaces, pedestrian pathways connecting homes to schools and shops and civic facilities, the automobile gently de-emphasized in favor of cleaner, quieter modes of local transportation. The community centre would be the heart of the neighbourhood. The children would walk to school through safe tree-lined paths. The adults would know their neighbours, participate in civic life, and return each evening to a home that had been quietly preparing for their arrival since they left that morning. The architectural firms and urban planning departments of the 1950s produced detailed proposals for these future suburbs with the serious institutional energy of people solving a problem rather than indulging a fantasy. Planned communities were developed as demonstrations, Reston in Virginia, Columbia in Maryland. Planned communities that attempted to implement some version of the integrated social vision the futurists had described. They built community centres and greenways and mixed-use town centres and pedestrian priority streetscapes, and they succeeded in creating communities that were genuinely different from the conventional suburb in meaningful ways. What they discovered in the process was that the suburb's relationship with the automobile was considerably more entrenched than the planning documents had assumed. The automobile did not yield gracefully to the pedestrian priority vision. The shopping centre at the edge of the planned community drew residents in their cars because it was convenient and cheap, and the town centre at the walkable heart of the community struggled to compete. The school bus replaced the walk to school, the garage expanded, the driveway widened. The suburb of the year 2000 was in many ways the suburb of the 1950s, extended outward over a larger area and furnished with more sophisticated appliances. The smart home technologies arrived in fragments, a programmable thermostat here, a security camera there, an automated irrigation system for the lawn, and were adopted selectively by homeowners who found them genuinely useful, and ignored by homeowners who found the setup process alienating and the monthly subscription fees cumulative. The home automation system that would manage the entire household seamlessly from a single control panel existed as a product category by the year 2000, but had not yet achieved the seamless integration that the push-button kitchen of the 1950s had imagined. What the suburb of the year 2000 did have, which the 1950s had not predicted, was the internet, which changed the social fabric of suburban life in ways that the community-minded planners of the earlier era would have found both encouraging and slightly alarming. Neighbours who might not have spoken connected through neighbourhood message boards. Information about community events, local services, and municipal decisions circulated at a speed the 1950s town hall meeting could not match. The shared community infrastructure that the futurists had imagined built in wood and glass and shared green space had arrived, invisibly, through fibre optic cable, present everywhere, visible nowhere, connecting the suburb into a community while its residents sat separately in identical houses on curved streets, glowing at their screens. If there was one area where 1950s optimism felt most justified, most urgently hopeful, and perhaps most humanly understandable, it was medicine. The early decades of the 20th century had already seen stunning medical advances, vaccines, antibiotics, surgical techniques that would have seemed miraculous just a generation earlier, and the 1950s were riding the momentum of all of it. Polio vaccines were arriving. The structure of DNA had just been discovered. The pace of medical science felt, to those living through it, like an ascending curve that would not level off, and so the predictions were bold. By the year 2000, cancer would be cured, or at least treated as routinely as infections were. Heart disease would be prevented before it developed. Aging itself might be slowed, or at least understood well enough to extend healthy life dramatically. The polio vaccine, developed by Jonas Salk and announced in 1955, provided a specific and vivid model for what medical progress at its best looked like. A disease that had paralysed hundreds of thousands of children every year was eliminated from the American population within a decade of the vaccine's introduction. The emotional weight of that achievement, the children in iron lungs, the summer swimming pools closed in fear, the before and after so dramatic that it registered as something almost beyond the merely scientific, gave the era a template for what medicine could do when it applied itself fully to a problem. Find the cause, develop the intervention, deploy it at scale, watch the disease disappear. The template was applied hopefully to cancer, heart disease, mental illness, and aging itself. The National Cancer Institute received dramatically increased funding on the premise that a sufficiently resourced scientific effort would crack the problem on a timeline measured in years or at most decades. Richard Nixon's 1971 declaration of a war on cancer was the explicit application of this model. The same determination and resource concentration that had beaten polio and put men on the moon would, it was assumed, defeat cancer within a similarly compressed timeline. The year 2000 was sometimes mentioned as a reasonable target for a world largely free of cancer. What the polio template concealed was that polio is caused by a single, stable virus, against which a single, stable vaccine could be developed and deployed. Cancer is not a single disease. It is a large family of diseases sharing the characteristic of uncontrolled cell growth, each caused by different combinations of genetic and environmental factors, each behaving differently in different tissue types and different patients, each requiring different treatment approaches whose effectiveness varies by patient in ways that molecular medicine was only beginning to understand by the year 2000. The problem was not a wall that effort could breach. It was a landscape of enormous complexity that yielded ground slowly and irregularly. Progress came, and it was genuine and significant. Survival rates for many cancers improved dramatically between 1955 and 2000 through better detection, improved surgical techniques, more targeted chemotherapy, and the early development of immunotherapy approaches. Heart disease mortality declined substantially thanks to better understanding of risk factors, improved emergency cardiac care, and the development of effective medications for blood pressure and cholesterol. Life expectancy increased. Infant mortality fell. The trajectory was exactly as the 1950s had hoped, just slower, more complicated, and more incomplete than the optimistic timeline had suggested. The diseases the 1950s could not name, the new viral pandemics, the chronic conditions shaped by sedentary modern life and processed food, the mental health consequences of an accelerating and isolating world arrived alongside the progress, patient and unhurried, filling the space that the cured diseases had vacated. By the year 2000, medicine had achieved things that would have seemed miraculous in 1954, and there remained things it could not yet do that 1954 had confidently scheduled for completion. The cure for everything had not arrived. The cure for some things had arrived, and the cures for other things were in progress, and the new things requiring cures were already queuing up with the quiet patience of problems that know they will eventually get their turn. Here is a prediction that you will find simultaneously hilarious and deeply melancholy, depending on what time you're reading this and how many unread messages are currently waiting in your various inboxes. In the 1950s, multiple serious economists, technologists, and social scientists predicted that by the year 2000, rising productivity enabled by automation and computing would reduce the standard working week to somewhere between 15 and 20 hours. Some predicted even less. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith wrote about the coming challenge of leisure. John Maynard Keynes had predicted in 1930 that his grandchildren might work 15 hours a week and would struggle to fill the remaining hours with meaningful activity. Others suggested the 3-hour workday as a realistic endpoint of technological progress. This was not considered utopian fantasy. It was considered applied economics. The logic was clean and internally consistent. If a machine could do the work of 10 people, then 10 people were freed from that work. If computing could handle the information processing that previously required a department of clerks, those clerks were freed from that processing. If automation could manage the production line, the factory workers were freed from the line. The gains from productivity, distributed across the working population in the form of reduced hours rather than increased output, would produce a society of unprecedented leisure whose challenge would be filling time rather than finding it. The economists who built these models were not being naive. They were following the logic of their own discipline to its reasonable conclusion. The conclusion turned out to be wrong, not because the productivity gains failed to materialize. They materialized exactly as predicted, and then some, but because the assumption about how those gains would be distributed was incorrect. In practice, the gains from productivity were captured primarily as increased output and profit, rather than reduced working hours. The worker whose productivity doubled through technology did not work half as many hours. They produced twice as much, or worked the same hours in a workplace with higher expectations, or found themselves competing with other workers willing to maintain the same output for less compensation. The 15-hour work week required not just technology, but a fundamental restructuring of how productivity gains were distributed, and that restructuring did not occur. Henry Ford in 1926 had reduced his workers' week from 6 days to 5, famously arguing that workers needed leisure time to become consumers of the products they made. The 40-hour week became standard in American manufacturing through the 1930s and 40s, and the expectation in the post-war era was that the same logic would continue reducing working hours as productivity continued rising. The 30-hour week seemed the obvious next step. The 20-hour week after that. The trajectory was clear. The trajectory stopped. The 40-hour week was roughly where it remained for the rest of the century, while productivity continued rising around it. And then, with the arrival of email and mobile communication technology, the effective working week began to extend beyond its official boundaries in ways that the timesheets did not capture, but the bodies certainly noticed. The commute became a working commute. The evening became a working evening. The vacation became a vacation with occasional check-ins that were each individually brief, but collectively added up to a vacation that was never quite entirely a vacation. By the year 2000, the 3-hour workday remained as distant as it had been in 1954, which is perhaps the most honest measure of how the century's productivity miracle had been allocated. The machines had done their share. The hours had simply been redeployed elsewhere, to higher output, to expanded expectations, to the particular modern form of busyness that fills every available minute with something that feels urgent and is often, in the longest view, not urgent at all. The leisure problem never arrived because the leisure never did. Somewhere between the prediction and the present, someone decided that if the machines were going to work harder, the people should too. Nobody voted on it. It just happened, the way most things happen, gradually, then completely, and by the time you noticed, it had already been normal for years. Among the more quietly idealistic predictions of 1950s, futurism was the belief that by the year 2000, humanity would have settled on a common global language, not necessarily replacing existing languages, but providing a universal second tongue that every educated person on Earth would share, enabling frictionless communication across borders, cultures, and continents. Esperanto had been kicking around since the 1880s with exactly this ambition, and various international organisations were genuinely enthusiastic about its potential. The spread of international travel, global trade, and eventually computing and communication technology, it was thought, would naturally accelerate the adoption of some kind of universal linguistic common ground. Esperanto itself was a serious proposal with serious intellectual backing. Its creator, Ludwig Lazarus Zamenhof, a Polish ophthalmologist who had grown up in a city of violent ethnic conflict between communities that could not communicate with each other, designed the language in 1887 with the explicit goal of creating a neutral second language that belonged to no nation and no culture, and could therefore serve as a medium of peaceful international exchange. The language was carefully constructed for ease of learning, regular grammar, no exceptions, a phonetic spelling system, and a vocabulary drawn from the most common roots across major European languages. A motivated adult could achieve basic competency in weeks rather than years. The Esperanto movement attracted genuine intellectual support in the early 20th century. Tolstoy praised it. Several Nobel Prize winners endorsed it. International Esperanto congresses drew thousands of participants from dozens of countries. The League of Nations debated making Esperanto its official language in the early 1920s. The proposal failed primarily because France objected to any language other than French serving this function, which is perhaps the most French outcome imaginable, and also a perfect illustration of why a neutral universal language was both obviously necessary and practically impossible. The United Nations was founded in 1945 with 6 official languages: Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian and Spanish, which required a substantial professional translation and interpretation infrastructure that consumed significant institutional resources, but reflected the political reality that major powers were not willing to conduct their diplomacy in someone else's language. The infrastructure was expensive and imperfect, and created constant opportunities for meaning to shift between languages in ways that could be significant. The argument for a universal language was, in practical terms, stronger than ever. The political will to implement one was exactly where it had always been. English, rather than any planned language, became the de facto global language of commerce, science, aviation, and digital communication through the combined force of British colonial history, American economic and cultural dominance in the post-war era, and the specific circumstance that the internet and the personal computer were developed primarily in English-speaking contexts and exported in that linguistic form. This was not a planned outcome. Nobody voted for English. It simply became, through the accumulated weight of economic and cultural history, the language in which most international business was conducted, and most academic science was published, and most international aviation was navigated. By the year 2000, Esperanto had approximately 2 million speakers, which was a genuine community of enthusiastic users and also significantly fewer than the population of Houston, which gave some sense of the distance between the dream and its realization. The global language had arrived. In a sense, it was just someone's language rather than everyone's, which meant it carried all the advantages and all the cultural freight of its origins, and which meant that the frictionless neutral communication the 1950s had imagined remained slightly more complicated than a single shared tongue could resolve. Language, it turned out, was not only about the words, it was about everything the words carried with them, which no planned language had ever quite managed to leave behind. In the 1950s, air quality in American industrial cities was genuinely terrible. Coal fires, factory emissions, automobile exhaust, and the cumulative output of rapid industrial expansion had created urban environments where the air was visibly dirty and the rivers were occasionally flammable. And yet, in many futurist predictions of the year 2000, pollution had been solved, cleanly, completely, without apparent drama. The cities of the imagined future were depicted as gleaming, light-filled, surrounded by green parks and clean waterways, the smokestacks and the grey skies of mid-century industry having been replaced by clean, efficient space-age power sources. Nuclear energy was going to do a lot of heavy lifting in these predictions. The assumption underlying the clean city vision was the same assumption that ran through most mid-century futurism, that the problems of the present would be solved by the technology of the future, and that the solving would happen more or less automatically as the technology developed. Industrial pollution was a problem of inefficiency, fuel being burned incompletely, waste being discharged because better disposal methods did not yet exist, and technology would resolve the inefficiency because that is what technology does. The clean city of the year 2000 was simply the industrial city with its problems corrected, the same basic engine running more smoothly. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught fire in June of 1969. This was not, it should be noted, the first time the Cuyahoga had caught fire. It had burned at least a dozen times since 1868, a record that perhaps should have prompted earlier concern. The 1969 fire was relatively minor by the river's own historical standards, lasting roughly 30 minutes and causing modest damage. But it was photographed and published in Time magazine alongside the question of whether America had the will to save its environment, and the image of a burning river landed in the public consciousness as a symbol of exactly how far the industrial present had drifted from the clean future the 1950s had imagined. The Clean Air Act of 1970 and the Clean Water Act of 1972 were genuine legislative achievements that improved American air and water quality measurably over the following decades. The Cuyahoga stopped catching fire. The air in Los Angeles, while still challenging, became substantially cleaner than it had been in the early 1970s, when photochemical smog was severe enough on bad days to cause eye irritation and respiratory distress in otherwise healthy people. The regulatory and technological tools for reducing industrial and automotive pollution had been developed, deployed, and proven effective in ways that represented genuine progress. What nobody in the 1950s had fully anticipated was that industrial pollution in the year 2000 would not primarily be a national problem with a national solution. It would be a global problem whose causes and consequences crossed every border. The atmospheric carbon accumulating from fossil fuel combustion did not stay over the country that produced it. The ozone hole that appeared over Antarctica was caused by chlorofluorocarbons released primarily in wealthy industrialized nations, but expressed itself most severely over a region inhabited by nobody. The solutions required not just national regulation, but international coordination among nations with different economic interests and different relationships to the industries producing the pollution. By the year 2000, the local air quality in American and European cities had improved substantially from its mid-century nadir. The global atmospheric chemistry was changing in ways that the 1950s clean city vision had not included in its projections, because in the 1950s the atmosphere was not yet understood as a system that could be altered at planetary scale by industrial activity. The pollution problem had been partially solved at the local level, and was simultaneously becoming a different and larger problem at the global level, with a complexity and a timeline that made the industrial smokestacks of 1954 look in retrospect like a problem of almost appealing simplicity. As the 1950s watched cities grow and sprawl, and as engineers began to imagine what could be built with the materials and techniques of the future, a particular fantasy emerged, the megacity, but not as a cautionary tale, as a triumphant achievement. By the year 2000, it was predicted the great cities of the world would not expand outward but upward into colossal vertical structures, mile-high skyscrapers housing tens of thousands of residents, self-contained towers with their own shops, parks, schools, and transit systems built into the structure itself. The city of the year 2000 would be a monument, ordered vertical, efficient, freed from the messiness of geography. Frank Lloyd Wright proposed a 1-mile-high skyscraper called the Illinois in 1956, entirely seriously, with detailed engineering calculations supporting his claims about its structural feasibility. The building would have been 528 floors, housed 100,000 occupants, and required a foundation extending 60 feet into the bedrock. Wright produced a 20-foot-tall drawing of the structure for its public presentation, and argued with characteristic confidence that the technology to build it either existed or was imminent. He was 78 years old when he made the proposal, and apparently entirely sincere. The theoretical case for extreme vertical density had genuine merit. Land in city centres was finite and expensive. The horizontal suburb consumed agricultural land and required enormous infrastructure investment in roads, utilities, and services spread across large areas. A vertical city concentrated population on a small footprint, leaving the surrounding land available for agriculture, green space, or simply nothing, a luxury that horizontal sprawl could not afford. The energy efficiency argument was also real. A dense vertical structure required less infrastructure per resident than a spread-out horizontal one, and the proximity of residents to each other and to shared facilities reduced transportation requirements dramatically. The Archie Graham Group in Britain took the vertical city concept into its most speculative territory in the 1960s, with proposals for plug-in cities where modular living capsules could be attached to massive infrastructure frameworks and replaced or relocated as needed. Cities as organisms that grew and changed rather than static monuments. The Japanese metabolism movement proposed floating cities, undersea cities, and towers of extraordinary height as solutions to population growth and land scarcity. These proposals were architecturally serious, structurally feasible in principle, and deeply compelling as images of what concentrated human ingenuity might produce. What the vertical city proposals consistently underestimated was the human preference for horizontal life, for ground contact, for personal outdoor space, for the specific psychological comfort of knowing that outside is accessible without an elevator. Residential towers of significant height had been built since the 1950s across American cities, and the sociological evidence about life in them was mixed at best. The high-rise public housing projects built in Chicago, St. Louis, and other American cities in the 1950s and 60s were demolished in the 1980s and 90s after decades of documented failure, their concentrated poverty and physical isolation having produced social outcomes that no architect's rendering had depicted. By the year 2000, the tallest buildings in the world were taller than anything the 1950s had built, and cities like Hong Kong, Singapore, and New York had achieved vertical densities that would have impressed Wright. But the mile-high inhabited tower had not been built. The self-contained vertical city with its internal parks and schools and civic spaces remained an architectural proposal rather than a built reality. Cities had grown upward at their cores and outward at their edges, the familiar pattern of horizontal sprawl and vertical concentration existing in tension as they always had, and the 50-million-person tower remained in the drawing, waiting for an engineering moment and a political will that had not quite coincided in the same city at the same time. What actually happened is that cities became cities, which is what they were always going to be, complicated, horizontal, stubbornly themselves, resistant to being solved by any single structure, however tall. One of the quieter predictions of 1950s futurism, quieter because it was more about economics than spectacle, and nobody illustrated it with a gleaming chrome illustration, was the cashless society. By the year 2000, it was predicted physical currency would be obsolete. Every transaction would be handled electronically, automatically, instantly. You would not carry a wallet. You would not count out bills at a register. Your earnings would arrive directly in your account. your expenses would leave directly from it, and the entire physical infrastructure of cash, the minting, the printing, the carrying, the losing it in the washing machine would belong to history. This prediction was actually among the more directionally accurate of the era. The credit card had arrived in its modern recognizable form by 1958, when Bank of America launched the Bank AmeriCard, later to become Visa, in Fresno, California, mailing unsolicited cards to 60,000 residents in what became known in banking history as the Fresno Drop, a mass experiment in consumer credit that was chaotic, poorly regulated, and wildly successful in demonstrating that Americans would use a card to pay for things if one was placed in their hands. The infrastructure of electronic payment, once the concept had been proven, expanded with remarkable speed through the following decades. Diners Club had already launched the first general-purpose charge card in 1950, initially accepted at 27 restaurants in New York City by 200 cardholders, most of whom were business executives expensing their meals. American Express entered the card business in 1958. The mechanics of the cashless transaction, the authorization, the clearing, the settlement between issuing and acquiring banks were worked out through the 1960s and 70s into a system of sufficient reliability and scale that by the 1980s the credit card was a standard feature of middle-class American life. The debit card arrived and linked the payment card directly to the bank account, removing the credit element and making electronic payment available to people who didn't want or could not obtain credit. The ATM arrived and made physical cash more conveniently accessible than it had ever been, which is a somewhat paradoxical contribution to the cashless future, a technology that made the cashless alternative more accessible while simultaneously making cash more convenient, with the net effect of making both more available rather than replacing one with the other. By the year 2000, electronic payment was ubiquitous, and the proportion of transactions conducted in cash was declining measurably. In many retail contexts, card payment had become the default, and cash the exception. Online commerce, which had emerged in the mid-1990s and was growing rapidly by 2000, was cashless by definition. You could not hand a physical banknote to a web server, which removed cash from an entire and rapidly expanding category of commercial activity. The trajectory toward the cashless society was real, and it was continuing. What the 1950s had not anticipated was the particular stubbornness of cash at the margins, in informal economies, in low-income communities without reliable banking access, in transactions between individuals that neither party particularly wanted recorded, and in the specific psychological comfort of physical money that turned out to be more durable than the futurists had estimated. Cash in the hand feels different from a number on a screen in ways that are not entirely rational, and are also not nothing. The tactile reality of a banknote carries meaning that a digital transaction does not replicate, and that meaning turned out to be valued enough that physical currency refused to disappear on schedule, and then cryptocurrency arrived in 2009, which was a new form of money that nobody in 1954 had predicted, and that many people in the year 2000 found confusing even after reading the explanation 3 times, and whose existence suggested that the human relationship with money was considerably more creatively chaotic than any futurist had accounted for. The cashless society came, approximately. The simple society did not. It never does. Education in the year 2000, as imagined by 1950s futurists, was going to be transformed root and branch by technology. Not just improved, transformed. The classroom as a physical space would become optional or obsolete. Teaching machines, early versions of which the psychologist B.F. Skinner was already developing in the 1950s, would provide personalized instruction to each student, adapting to their pace, their strengths, their gaps in knowledge, delivering the optimal learning experience without the inefficiencies of one teacher, managing 30 students with 30 different needs simultaneously. Television would bring the world's greatest teachers into every living room. By the year 2000, every child, regardless of location or economic circumstance, would have access to the best education humanity could provide, delivered through screens and machines that never tired and never lost their patience. Skinner's teaching machine was not a metaphor, he built it. In 1954, he presented a working device, a box containing a paper scroll of questions that the student answered by writing in a small window, after which the correct answer was revealed and the scroll advanced to the next question, to a Harvard audience with the conviction of someone who had solved a fundamental problem of human learning. The machine provided immediate feedback, which Skinner's behavioral psychology identified as the key mechanism of effective learning, and it did so consistently, patiently, and without the variability that human teachers inevitably introduced. The teaching machine, improved and scaled and eventually computerized, would make the quality of instruction independent of the quality of any individual teacher. Geography, economic circumstance, the accident of which school you happen to attend, all of these would become irrelevant. The educational television movement of the 1950s and 60s embodied a different version of the same dream. If the world's best teacher of mathematics could be broadcast into every classroom in the country simultaneously, the average quality of mathematics instruction would rise to the level of the best. The Ford Foundation funded educational television experiments. The Carnegie Corporation supported them. Public broadcasting emerged partly from this vision of television as an educational medium, a delivery mechanism for quality instruction to populations that geography or poverty had previously excluded from access to it. Sesame Street, which launched in 1969, was the most successful realization of this vision, a program explicitly designed using learning research to deliver measurable educational outcomes to preschool children, particularly those in low-income households who might not have access to preschool programs. The research showed it worked. Children who watched Sesame Street regularly demonstrated better letter and number recognition than those who did not. Educational television, at its best, delivered on the promise the 1950s had made for it. What the teaching machine advocates had underestimated was the social dimension of education, the things that happen in a classroom that are not the efficient transfer of information from instructor to student, the negotiation of disagreement, the experience of working with people who think differently, the development of the capacity to sustain attention in the presence of other humans whose attention is also required, the modelling of intellectual behaviour by a teacher who is visibly engaged with ideas. These things did not transfer to a screen with the same fidelity that content transferred, and they turned out to matter in ways that the behaviourist framework of the teaching machine had not fully captured. The internet arrived and placed more educational content within reach of more people than any previous technology in history. Khan Academy launched in 2006 and offered free instruction in mathematics and science to anyone with an internet connection, embodying the teaching machine dream in a form its inventor would have recognized. Online universities proliferated. Lectures from the world's greatest universities became freely accessible to anyone who wanted to watch them. The access problem that the 1950s had identified was substantially addressed by the technology the 21st century provided. The learning problem remained. Access to content and acquisition of knowledge are related but not identical, and the gap between them is where most of the difficult work of education actually happens, the sustained effort, the productive struggle, the social accountability of a classroom where other people can see whether you have done the reading. The education machine arrived. It turned out to be a library more than a teacher, which is genuinely useful and genuinely not the same thing. The screen delivered the content. The learning remained stubbornly human. In the 1950s, materials science was advancing at a pace that felt genuinely revolutionary, and the predictions about the materials that would construct the world of the year 2000 were accordingly bold. Plastics were new, exciting, and versatile, and while their eventual ubiquity was correctly anticipated, the exact nature of the plastic world of the year 2000 was not quite what anyone had in mind. Beyond plastics, futurists predicted an entire range of new synthetic materials that would replace every natural substance with something stronger, lighter, more durable, and more elegant. Houses would be built from materials that were currently undiscovered. Clothing would be woven from fibers that clean themselves, regulated temperature, and perhaps changed colour on request. The future, in materials terms, would be unrecognisable from the present. Nylon had arrived in 1935 and demonstrated what synthetic polymer chemistry could produce, a material with properties that no natural fibre matched, manufacturable at industrial scale, applicable across an enormous range of products from stockings to toothbrush bristles to parachute fabric. The nylon moment crystallized the promise of synthetic materials, that chemistry could produce to specification, creating substances with precisely the properties required, rather than being limited to whatever nature happened to provide. The post-nylon materials science vision was of a world where every substance was designed rather than discovered, engineered rather than grown, optimized rather than merely used. The post-war decades delivered on significant portions of this vision. Fiberglass arrived and became the material of choice for boat hulls, car bodies, and aircraft components, where its combination of lightweight and structural strength replaced heavier metal alternatives. Kevlar arrived in 1965, discovered by Stephanie Kwolek at DuPont, a polymer fibre 5 times stronger than steel by weight, that found applications in body armour, cut-resistant gloves, and high-performance structural components. Carbon fibre composites arrived and achieved strength-to-weight ratios that allowed aerospace engineers to build structures of extraordinary performance. Gore-Tex arrived and produced the waterproof, breathable membrane that the outdoor industry had been theoretically requesting for decades. Memory foam arrived, originally developed by NASA for aircraft cushioning, and eventually made its way into mattresses across the world, where it remains the most successful example of space program technology entering consumer bedding. These were genuine achievements that the 1950s materials optimism had correctly projected in general terms. Synthetic materials with designed properties had proliferated across every sector of the economy exactly as predicted. The building, automotive, aerospace, medical, sporting goods, and consumer electronics industries all relied on materials that did not exist in 1954, and whose properties would have seemed remarkable to the engineers of that era. What had not arrived was the self-cleaning fabric, which remained a laboratory demonstration rather than a wardrobe staple. Textiles embedded with titanium dioxide nanoparticles could decompose organic stains in ultraviolet light under laboratory conditions, but the real-world performance was inconsistent, and the laundering requirements were not eliminated so much as reduced, which is useful, but not the revolutionary domestic liberation that the 1950s had sketched. The colour-changing clothing existed in novelty form. Heat-sensitive pigments produced the hypercolour shirts of the early 1990s, which changed colour with body heat, and were briefly fashionable before people noticed that the colour changes highlighted exactly the areas of the body where heat was being generated, which was mostly the armpits, which was not the intended aesthetic effect. The most ubiquitous new material of the year 2000 turned out to be the single-use plastic container, the water bottle, the food packaging, the shopping bag, which was everywhere and cheap and convenient and accumulating in the ocean in quantities that the materials science optimists of the 1950s had not projected, because the concept of a material persisting in the environment for centuries after its useful life had ended was not part of the prediction. The new materials arrived. They were extraordinary. They were also, in their less glorious applications, immortal in ways that the 1950s had not planned for, and the year 2000 was only beginning to reckon with. The 1950s were also the early years of the Cold War, and beneath all the gleaming optimism of the futurist predictions ran a cold and very real current of nuclear dread. The year 2000, in many 1950s imaginations, was haunted by the possibility that humanity might not make it there at all, that the weapons of the atomic age might resolve the 20th century before it finished. And yet, the more optimistic futurists proposed a different reading of the nuclear age, that the very destructiveness of atomic weapons would make large-scale war between major powers obsolete. If both sides knew that war meant mutual annihilation, then rational actors would not start a war. The balance of terror would become paradoxically a guarantor of peace. The theory of nuclear deterrence was developed with genuine intellectual seriousness at institutions like the Rand Corporation, where analysts including Herman Kahn and Bernard Brodie applied game theory and strategic logic to the question of how nuclear-armed states would behave toward each other. The conclusion that mutual assured destruction created a stable if terrifying equilibrium in which neither side could rationally initiate a conflict was not cheerful, but it was coherent, and it drove American and Soviet strategic planning for the duration of the Cold War. The weapons whose existence the 1950s found most frightening were, in the deterrence framework, also the weapons that made the worst outcome least likely. It was optimism of a very particular kind, the optimism of someone who has thought carefully about a horrible situation and concluded that its very horribleness is the thing that prevents it from occurring. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 tested this framework at its most extreme. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood at the edge of a nuclear exchange that both sides understood would be catastrophic, and neither side could fully control. The crisis was resolved through a combination of back-channel diplomacy, personal restraint from both Kennedy and Khrushchev, and a degree of luck that subsequent historical research has made clear was more significant than either government wished to acknowledge at the time. A Soviet submarine commander named Vasily Arkhipov refused to authorize a nuclear torpedo launch during the crisis, when the other two officers whose consent was required had already agreed, a decision made by one individual under extreme pressure in an information-poor environment that may have been the most consequential single human choice of the 20th century. The deterrence framework held the major nuclear powers did not fight a direct war, but the stability it produced was considerably more fragile and more accident-prone than the clean strategic logic of the theorists had suggested. There were multiple incidents during the Cold War in which technical failures, misidentified radar returns, or command and control breakdowns brought nuclear systems to states of readiness that their operators did not intend, and that the political leadership was not aware of until after the fact. The system worked, in the sense that the weapons were not fired. It worked with less margin than anyone found comfortable. By the year 2000, the predicted nuclear war had not occurred, which remained the most important thing about the 20th century that the 21st century inherited. The Cold War had ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, an outcome that the deterrence theorists had not specifically predicted, but that the logic of their framework had perhaps prepared. The nuclear arsenals remained, reduced from their Cold War peaks but still present, still operational, still requiring the same careful management that had prevented their use for 50 years. The world of the year 2000 was not at peace in any comprehensive sense. Regional conflicts, civil wars, and the particular new form of asymmetric violence that would define the early 21st century were all present and active. But the specific catastrophe the 1950s had most feared, the thermonuclear exchange between superpowers that would end the civilization that was doing all the predicting, had not arrived. The balance of terror had held. The rational actors had behaved mostly rationally, and the single most important prediction of the era, that humanity would still be here by the year 2000 to evaluate whether the other predictions had come true, turned out to be correct, which is, when you think about it carefully and at length, quite a lot to be grateful for. And so here we arrive at the end, which is also, in a way, the beginning, because what is most remarkable about the year 2000 is actually experienced, standing inside it, living through its ordinary days, is how ordinary it felt to the people in it. Not the shimmering, efficient, chrome-plated marvel that the 1950s had imagined. Not a world of solved problems and automated ease and personal helicopters and food pills. Just a world, complicated, messy, surprising in ways nobody had predicted, stubbornly resistant to simplification, full of people still arguing about parking and still losing their keys and still lying awake at 2 a.m. thinking about things they could not change. The flying car had not arrived. The robot housekeeper was still mostly theoretical. The food pill had been rejected in favour of 17 different cuisines available for delivery within 30 minutes. The megacity was horizontal and full of traffic. The computers were everywhere and extraordinary, and in the quiet hours of the evening were being used by a significant number of people to watch something that would help them fall asleep. The future had arrived. It was not what they expected. It was, in its own stubborn and very human way, exactly what it needed to be. There is something worth sitting with in the specific texture of the year 2000's ordinariness. The Y2K bug, the possibility that computer systems using 2-digit year codes would interpret the year 2000 as 1900 and fail catastrophically. Crashing financial systems and power grids and aircraft navigation had been the final large-scale anxiety of the millennium, the last chance for the future to arrive as drama rather than as Tuesday. Billions of dollars were spent correcting the problem in advance. On the night of December 31st, 1999, the world's clocks ticked over to the year 2000, and the lights stayed on, and the planes kept flying, and the ATMs kept working, and people at parties around the world looked at each other with the slightly deflated expression of those who had prepared extensively for a disaster that did not materialize. The year 2000 arrived as an ordinary January morning. People went to work, children went to school, the mail arrived, the coffee was hot, the commute was the usual length and the usual frustration. The future that had been anticipated with such elaborate specificity for 50 years turned out to feel, on arrival, remarkably like the present it replaced, which is, if you think about it, the most accurate thing that can be said about any future once it has become the present. Futures always feel like presents from the inside. The chrome and the optimism belong to the anticipation. The actual experience is just Tuesday, with different appliances. The 1950s futurists were not foolish. Many of their predictions were directionally correct. Electronic payment, global communication networks, advances in medicine and materials, the broad computerization of daily life, the beginning of commercial space activity. They saw the general direction of travel with reasonable accuracy. What they consistently misjudged was the texture of the arrival, the way the future always brings new problems alongside its solutions, the way human behavior adapts to new technology in ways that preserve familiar patterns rather than eliminating them, the way comfort and habit and the deep mammalian preference for the known shape the adoption of the new in ways that no engineering projection captures. They imagined a future that had been solved. What arrived was a future that had simply become the present, with all the present's characteristic resistance to being solved, its preference for complexity over elegance, its stubborn insistence on remaining human in the face of every technological invitation to become something more efficient and less messy. The people of the year 2000 were tired, occasionally, and busy, frequently, and uncertain about the future, continuously, exactly as the people of 1954 had been, exactly as the people of every year have been, in the long, unbroken human tradition of living inside a present that the past could only partially imagine. And yet the year 2000 was also extraordinary in ways that are easy to overlook, precisely because they arrived gradually and became normal before anyone had time to be astonished. A child born in the year 2000 had access to the accumulated knowledge of human civilization through a device they could hold in one hand. The diseases that had killed half of all children in previous centuries were, in the wealthy world, largely absent. The communication technology that allowed a person to speak in real time with someone on the other side of the planet was cheap enough to take for granted. The material standard of living available to an ordinary person in the year 2000 would have seemed, to the people of 1954, like the fulfillment of a very large number of their predictions. The future came. It was imperfect and incomplete and nothing like the illustrations. It was also, in the ways that mattered most to most people on most days, better than the world it replaced. And somewhere in a quiet room, at a desk under a lamp, someone was already drawing the next version of the future, chrome and optimistic and full of solved problems, and the beautiful, incorrigible process was beginning again. Let's take a vacation. Not your vacation. The vacation the 1950s promised you. The one where you climbed into a supersonic passenger aircraft in New York at 9 in the morning and stepped off in London in time for an early lunch, well rested, impeccably dressed, having spent the crossing in a pressurized cabin of such extraordinary comfort that the experience of travelling across an ocean felt less like a journey and more like a leisurely afternoon in a very sophisticated lounge that happened to be moving. The future of tourism in the 1950s imagination was speed married to elegance, the world made small, the distances made irrelevant, every destination within reach of anyone with a weekend free and a spirit of mild adventure. The supersonic passenger aircraft was not merely a dream. It was a project with a schedule and a budget, and engineers who believed in it, with the wholehearted conviction of people building something they expected to take their own children to school on. The Concorde, developed jointly by Britain and France through the 1960s, made its first commercial flight in 1976 and flew passengers between London and New York in 3 hours and 30 minutes, less than half the time of a conventional subsonic flight. The aircraft was real, operational, and genuinely supersonic, cruising at twice the speed of sound at an altitude where the curvature of the Earth was visible through the oval windows. For the passengers who flew it, it delivered precisely what the 1950s had promised. The Atlantic became an inconvenience rather than a journey. The American supersonic transport program ran alongside the Concorde's development, with federal funding and Boeing engineering, and the expectation that supersonic travel would become standard for transcontinental and transoceanic routes within a decade of entry into service. The projections showed declining costs as production scaled, expanding routes as the technology matured, and a gradual democratization of supersonic travel that would bring it within reach of ordinary travellers by the 1990s. The timeline was specific. The confidence was genuine. The sonic boom was the problem nobody had fully solved. The pressure wave produced by an aircraft travelling faster than sound propagated across the ground below the flight path as a loud, concussive boom that was experienced by everyone beneath it, regardless of whether they had purchased a ticket. Over oceans, this was irrelevant. Over land, in countries where the populations below the flight path had voting rights and telephones, and elected representatives who wanted to hear from them, supersonic overland flight proved practically and politically impossible. The American SST program was cancelled by Congress in 1971 after environmental hearings that combined legitimate acoustic concerns with a broader 1970s skepticism about large-scale technological projects that had not been present in the 1950s when the projections were made. The Concorde flew for 27 years, carrying a small and wealthy clientele at great expense before being retired in 2003. The aircraft that was supposed to democratize speed across the Atlantic instead became a premium product for a limited market. Real, impressive, and precisely the opposite of the mass-market future the 1950s had imagined. A first-class ticket on the Concorde in its final years cost approximately $10,000 for a transatlantic crossing. The 1950s illustration of a smiling middle-class family boarding their supersonic aircraft for a weekend in Paris had made certain assumptions about ticket pricing that the Concorde's operating economics did not support. Meanwhile, the actual transformation of mass tourism came not from supersonic flight, but from the wide-body subsonic jet. The Boeing 747, which entered service in 1970, carried twice as many passengers as previous jets at lower cost per seat, and the economics of scale it produced drove airfares down to levels that made international travel accessible to the middle class in a way that no previous generation had experienced. By the year 2000, hundreds of millions of people were flying annually on routes that would have required considerable wealth to access in 1954. Budget airlines operating on thin margins and high volumes had made flights between European cities cheaper than the train. The world had become small, exactly as predicted. It had become small on a discount carrier with a middle seat and a carry-on bag, which is not the image that featured in the Collier's magazine illustration, but which represents, in its unglamorous way, a more complete democratization of travel than the supersonic future would have achieved. The future of tourism arrived therefore as a paradox, faster and cheaper and more widely available than the 1950s imagined, but less elegant, less comfortable, and considerably more complicated both logistically and environmentally than the Chrome and Concorde vision had suggested. The jet age vacation came true. It came true in coach. Here is something remarkable. The internet, the single technology that most transformed daily life between 1954 and the year 2000, was not predicted in any recognizable form by the mainstream futurism of the 1950s. The flying car was predicted, the food pill was predicted, the domestic robot was predicted, the supersonic holiday was predicted, the global communications network that would connect every computer to every other computer and allow any person to access any information from anywhere and communicate with anyone in real time was not predicted, not in its actual form, not with its actual social consequences, not with its actual texture of use that involved both the sum of human knowledge and an extraordinary quantity of arguments about things that didn't matter. The closest the 1950s came to predicting the internet was the vision of a centralized information utility, a single enormous computer, or a small number of them, to which citizens would submit queries through terminals and from which answers would be returned. Vannevar Bush's 1945 essay described a hypothetical machine called the Memex that would store and retrieve documents through a system of associative links, allowing the user to follow chains of related information the way a human mind follows chains of thought. Bush described the essential concept of hypertext 3 decades before the word existed, but his vision remained a thought experiment rather than an engineering proposal, and didn't circulate widely enough to shape the mainstream futurist imagination of the following decade. ARPANET, the network that became the Internet's direct ancestor, was developed by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and first went operational in 1969, initially connecting 4 university computers in California and Utah. Its original purpose was military and academic, a resilient communications network that could survive a nuclear attack by routing traffic around damaged nodes, and a platform for sharing computing resources between research institutions. The people who built it understood what they were creating technically. Nobody understood what it would eventually become socially, commercially, or culturally. The engineers who connected those four computers in 1969 were not imagining a platform on which, 3 decades later, billions of people would share photographs of their meals, purchase things they did not need at 3 in the morning, read breaking news before the newspapers had finished printing it, and argue with complete strangers about films they had not seen. The World Wide Web, the graphical interface layer that made the internet navigable by non-technical users, was invented by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN in 1989 and became publicly available in 1991. The first graphical web browser, Mosaic, launched in 1993. By 1995, commercial internet service was available to the general public in the United States and spreading rapidly across the developed world. The speed at which the web went from laboratory tool to mass consumer medium was extraordinary, even by the standards of an era accustomed to rapid technological change. Roughly 5 years from Mosaic to a medium that tens of millions of people were using daily for commerce, communication, entertainment, and information in ways that were already beginning to reshape industries and social patterns simultaneously. What the internet delivered by the year 2000 was something that had no precise equivalent in any previous futurist vision. Not a tool with a specific defined purpose, like the telephone or the television, but a general-purpose medium that could be all tools simultaneously, adapting to any use its users found for it, expanding to fill any social space that previous media had left unoccupied. It was simultaneously a library and a post office and a marketplace and a newsstand and a social club and a cinema and a gaming hall and a notice board and a rumour mill and an encyclopedia, and it was all of these things at once, available continuously, accessible from a device that could fit in a coat pocket. The information superhighway metaphor that journalists and politicians used throughout the 1990s suggested a smooth, orderly, well-managed infrastructure along which information would flow cleanly from verified producers to grateful consumers. What arrived was considerably less orderly, considerably more generative, and considerably more difficult to govern than the highway metaphor implied. Everyone was simultaneously a producer and a consumer. The quality of information varied from the extraordinary to the catastrophically false, with no reliable infrastructure for distinguishing between them at scale. The social consequences of universal connectivity were being understood in real time by societies experiencing them, without the benefit of any previous experience to draw on. Nobody in 1954 predicted this. Nobody predicted that the most transformative technology of the century's second half would emerge not from aerospace or nuclear engineering or the consumer appliance industry, but from a Defense Department research network and a physicist at a Swiss particle physics laboratory trying to help his colleagues share documents. Some futures do not arrive from the direction you're watching. They come from somewhere you were not looking, already moving fast by the time you notice them, already reshaping the landscape before anyone has written the prediction. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed in your climate-controlled room, with your refrigerator humming quietly in the kitchen, and your phone charging on the nightstand and hot water available at any hour simply by turning a handle, take a moment, just a small and quiet moment, to consider what the people of 1954 were hoping for when they drew their gleaming cities and their flying cars and their chrome-plated domestic robots and sent them forward through time like letters addressed to you. They were not wrong to hope. They were not foolish to dream. They were people sitting in their own ordinary present, looking forward with the particular human hunger for something better and doing what humans have always done, imagining a future in which the difficulties of today have been resolved by the ingenuity of tomorrow. The food pill never arrived. The flying car is still on its way. The robot is still folding laundry somewhere in a laboratory, preparing for a domestic debut that keeps getting rescheduled. And yet here you are, in a world that would have astonished them in ways they did not predict and fulfilled them in ways they did not expect. They survived their present. You inherited it. Everything between them and you, every unglamorous, imperfect, stubbornly human step of the journey, brought you here, to this bed, to this quiet, to this particular Tuesday evening that required nothing extraordinary of you and asked only that you rest. The future they imagined was chrome and certain and lit from within by the confidence of people who believed the hard work had already been done. The future that arrived was softer than that and more complicated and considerably more interesting, because it was made not of chrome but of people, stubborn, creative, contradictory, endlessly adapting people who took the world they inherited and changed it in directions nobody had fully predicted and built from it something that, for all its imperfections, still deserves a quiet moment of gratitude before the lights go down. So let the predictions go now. Let the flying cars drift upward into the soft dark where imagined futures live. Let the food pills dissolve. Let the underwater cities fill with the quiet water of an ocean that has been keeping its own counsel for far longer than any of us have been making plans. Let the electronic brains think their slow, enormous thoughts in their humming rooms. Let the moving sidewalks carry their imaginary passengers through their immaculate cities toward destinations that were always more beautiful in the illustration than in the arrival. You're here. The present arrived as it always does, without its chrome finish, but with everything that matters, warmth and breath, and the slow unwinding of a day completed. The 1950s believed in tomorrow with a conviction that was generous and hopeful and genuinely admirable, and tomorrow came, and it was this, and this is enough, and you can sleep now. The future already happened. It turned out to be tonight, and tonight is very, very quiet. Good night.